Hi, welcome back to the AV room. Today we're going to go back in time, back to 1986. That would have made me 16 years old. Just got my driver's license, just got my first car, and cruising around Metro Detroit, Detroit City, cruising up and down the boulevards, listening to music. Lots of rap, lots of pop, lots of alternative, and a smattering of heavy metal. One thing stood out about everything. There are movie soundtracks, then there are cultural documents. Pretty in Pink soundtrack isn't just tied to a film. It's, for a lot of people, it's the movie. In fact, there's a strong argument to be made that the soundtrack has outlived the film. We're here to talk about Pretty in Pink, this soundtrack, one that changed many of our lives and has continued to be in rotation in many of our playlists. Released in 1986, Pretty in Pink arrived at the exact moment when college radio, new wave, alternative rock, and mainstream pop collided. And unlike most soundtracks of the era, this one didn't feel like an afterthought. It felt curated. Today I want to talk about why the Pretty in Pink soundtrack still works to this day, here in 2025. It's still getting talked about, it's still getting played, and why it mattered so much in the mid-80s, and why, decades later, it might be the most influential soundtrack ever assembled. Now, you can't talk about Pretty in Pink without talking about John Hughes. While he didn't direct the film, he was the film. He didn't just use music to decorate his films, he used it to define characters. He understood that music wasn't background. It was the identity of the characters in the film itself. Now, in the mid-1980s, Hughes was one of the very few mainstream filmmakers who trusted alternative music. Bands that weren't in the top 40. They carried emotional weight to many of us teenagers growing up in those times. And Pretty in Pink was where that philosophy peaked. Instead of hiring just one composer and leaning on safe pop hits, Hughes and the soundtrack team pulled directly from UK new wave, post-punk, college radio stations, underground romantic melancholy. The soundtrack didn't chase trends, it validated them. Now, let's start with the obvious, the theme song. Pretty in Pink by the Psychedelic Furs. Now, this song wasn't written for the movie. It was originally released in 1981, but they re-recorded it. And the version used in the film was this re-recorded 1986 version. It was smoother, it was glossier, and it was more cinematic. And this is important. The Furs were never a pop band. They were a moody, art rock, post-punk group that somehow crossed over without losing their credibility. Now, the recorded version became the Psychedelic Furs' biggest hit. Think about that for a second. Their biggest hit was a re-recorded track for a movie. And in many ways, it defined the romantic sadness of the decade, especially in the movie. It's ironic. A song about emotional detachment and exploitation became an anthem for teenage longing. It's that contradiction that makes it work. How about the Smiths? They include Please, Please, Please. It's the moment the soundtrack goes to legendary status. Please, Please, Please Let Me Get What I Want is barely 2 minutes long. I mean, it's short, but it might be the emotional center to the entire album. It's definitely fragile, hopeless, and painfully sincere. The song just doesn't explain emotions, it feels them. For countless American listeners, especially us teenagers in '86, this soundtrack was many of our first exposure to the Smiths. And once you hear the song at the right age, it never really leaves you. It told a generation it's okay to be alienated and it's okay to feel misunderstood. It mattered. Now, one of the reasons that the Pretty in Pink soundtrack is so well loved is because it isn't chasing the plot beat for beat. It's actually more about the mood. You've got bands like New Order bringing synth, electronic, icy elegance. You've got Echo and the Bunnymen delivering drama and plenty of mystique. You've got bands like Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark balancing synth pop optimism with sheer melancholy. These bands weren't chosen because they were chart toppers, and that's not an insult to the movie. It's a testament that shows how powerful music can be when you trust it and you let it work. Now, New Order's Shell Shock is one of the most energetic tracks on the album. It's a reminder that alternative music could move without becoming disposable. This was a band born from the ashes of Joy Division, and they started making dance music that still carried the emotional weight of the previous band. Now, OMD's If You Leave was written directly for the film. It became a massive hit. Love it or hate it, it's inseparable from the ending of the film. In fact, when I was 16, it was my then girlfriend's song for us. Many of us had those, right? It was If You Leave for This Guy. And trust me, many people told me in high school how much I reminded them of Ducky. Do you remember Ducky, John Cryer's character? I heard it all the time at the mall. Hey, Ducky. That was me. That's how I dressed. That's how I looked. And now I take it as a compliment. But back then, I was pretty bummed every time somebody shouted it at me at the mall. At least nobody dumped a drink on me like in Weird Science. What's fascinating is that OMD didn't want to write it. They didn't really want to record it. They actually felt it was too commercial of a song. Yet decades later, it's one of their most enduring songs. That tension between art and commerce runs through the entire soundtrack. Now, there's other bands that fill this thing out, and it's the deeper cuts that actually complete the story. Let's talk about those. Now, one of the reasons that the Pretty in Pink soundtrack holds up is that it isn't all wall-to-wall British new wave. There's deeper cuts on this album, and those deeper cuts add emotional contrast and leave it from feeling too one note. Take Suzanne Vega, her song Left of Center. It actually features here a collaboration with, of all people, Joe Jackson. Yep, that Joe Jackson, the piano maestro, who's about to have a new album drop. Her song Left of Center brings a quieter, more introspective tone to the album. It's almost conversational. Vega's voice has a detached intimacy, and paired with Joe Jackson's subtle sophistication, it feels like a pause button on teenage chaos. It's reflective, it's adult, and it's grounded. It's a reminder that Pretty in Pink isn't just about high school drama, but it's about self-definition and who you are inside. Then there's the Danny Hutton Hitters, covering a song made famous, yep, it's a cover song, by Nick Kershaw earlier. I think his was in 83 and this was in 86. So many people didn't know this is a cover song. Now, Danny Hutton Hitters didn't ever have anything else, any other hits that I know of. Maybe you do. Let me know in the comments. But this is where the soundtrack really kicks into energy. It's less moody and more kinetic. It's the kind of song that underscores motion, change, and momentum. It prevents the album from seeking too dark into melancholy, and a little bit reminds you of what it's like to be restless, impulsive, and loud. Now, I wonder if they wanted to get Nick Kershaw onto the soundtrack and he wouldn't allow it, so they went the label route and got the rights to the song and had someone cover it. That was the Danny Hutton Hitters. If you know, let me know. I couldn't find anything on it, but it sure seems like something that happened. The Nick Kershaw song is a great song. And if you love this version, look into his version. Now, the next two artists on this soundtrack are two of my favorites on the soundtrack, if not favorites from this time period. Fresh off his work with The Time, keeping that Minneapolis sound, is Jesse Johnson. Jesse Johnson's contribution is especially interesting. The label really seemed to be behind him and heavily pushed his solo work as well. So it's nice to see that he ended up on this soundtrack. Now, Jesse Johnson's contribution is especially interesting. Fresh off his work in the Minneapolis scene with Prince and The Time, that Minneapolis sound was kept for this cut from Jesse. Johnson adds a funk confidence to this soundtrack, which otherwise is dominated by synths and introspection. His track, however, is about style, attitude, and presence. It's a reminder of how cool Jesse was, and that cool can be expressive, not just withdrawn. So Jesse Johnson really kicks this one into gear. Now, Jesse's track, Get to Know Ya, is one of the cooler tracks Jesse's done in his career. And he's had a couple hit singles. Check him out. Check out his solo work. His debut album is one of my favorite debuts from that period. And I couldn't wait every time he dropped another album. He's got several great albums, but this cut really adds a lot to the album. It adds his confidence. It adds his cool. It's got that Prince kind of vibe, but also a little bit more Jesse. You know what I mean if you're a fan of his. It's a great song. Turn it up. There isn't a video for it, but you'll find other Jesse Johnson videos online that you can group to. Do look into his debut album at the very least. So then there's INXS. Their cut Do What You Do. Not what you do, W-H-A-T, but what, W-O-T. That's how cool the 80s were. Everybody spelled things phonetically or just plain wrong. I'm looking at you, Prince. But INXS was on the verge of massive global superstardom. They hadn't reached it yet, but they were definitely on their way. Their inclusion adds a darker, more physical edge, music that feels lived in. Michael Hutchence and his lead vocals kill on this track. It will get you out of your chair, couch, or the bed you're sleeping in if you're a teenager, and really get you moving. It's almost slightly dangerous. It really bridges the gap between alternative credibility and mainstream pop appeal. They were sort of starting in alternative and crossing over into pop where they definitely exploded. It mirrors, in many ways, what Pretty in Pink was doing in the film itself. INXS does not soften themselves for this soundtrack. They bring intensity, they bring groove, they bring a sense of movement that balance out the album's emotional weights and really helps you dance a little bit. Same with Jesse's track. It really is a groove-oriented album, and I think many of these songs, jumping from one to the next, are just sequenced so beautifully. You can't help but fall in love with the soundtrack. There's also the artist Louis Sum with his song Round Round. This is pure mid-80s art pop elegance. His track adds polish and emotional ambiguity, not unlike himself. Not quite happy, not quite sad. It's the sound of longing wrapped in synthesizers. It perfectly captures the feeling of wanting something without knowing how to ask for it. But Lewis had a couple singles, and he really locked into that androgynous look that was so big in '86. And his song, even if you never hear any of his other songs, really stands out amongst some real heavy hitters. Look into his singles. They're really worth your time. I wonder if he would have been more successful if they had promoted him a little bit more, other than hiding him on this soundtrack, which often was a way to get rid of people. But I have a funny feeling in this case, it really was something that John Hughes wanted to put on the album. So here's where we get to Echo and the Bunnymen. Echo and the Bunnymen. Think about if the Doors meet the Cure head on. Probably why they covered People Are Strange for the Lost Boys soundtrack, because their contribution to this soundtrack was so incredible. Echo and the Bunnymen add something crucial to this soundtrack, and I would say it's scale. Their contribution definitely brings drama, mystery, and cinematic tension. Ian McCullough, one of the best frontmen in rock history, adds his warbling voice to this track, and it sounds larger than the scene that it's in itself. It really is romantic, distant, and mythic, all at the same time. Where the Smiths turned inward, Echo and the Bunnymen looked outward and gave the album a sense of emotional grandeur. Now, they make teenagers' feelings feel epic, like everything matters right now. Their sense of artistic approach to the music and the visuals. The video for this song is amazing. Watch it. The opening will have you in stitches. Echo and the Bunnymen is one of those bands I always wanted to see. I just never got to see them. They never came any time that I could make it. I think they came later in the 90s when he left the band to Detroit, but I didn't catch that show. I did listen to the album. It was pretty good, even though it wasn't Ian good. But them on this soundtrack just seems to make sense. All these bands just seem to make sense. So the Pretty in Pink soundtrack. It was for kids who didn't feel like they fit the mold. The soundtrack felt like recognition. It felt like the soundtrack to our life. It's what it was. It was the soundtrack to our life. If the 70s had Saturday Night Fever, and if your 50s parents had Grease, then Pretty in Pink was ours. Along with The Lost Boys, it was one of those soundtracks that really just seemed to strike at all the right chords at all the right times. Now, for kids that didn't fit the mold, and I felt like one of them, it made me feel like the thrift store clothes I was buying and wearing. It made me feel like the bedroom loneliness I felt listening to all these songs was my soundtrack. It added emotional honesty. It didn't explain feelings, it validated them. On vinyl, the sequencing mattered, much like the mastering by Bernie Grudman, which crushed it. The the song, the soundtrack, it's not a playlist. It's more like a statement. Kids today have playlists. They put them together, and there's really no flow to it. They're just jamming their favorite songs together. You could argue maybe, yeah, mixtapes are still being made, but this is like the ultimate mixtape. This has got some of the greatest bands, maybe even some you haven't heard of, but you love those songs. Side A pulls you in emotionally, and side B is the reflection. The soundtrack sold millions, millions of records, millions of cassette tapes. Now, it often is said about Pretty in Pink that the soundtrack outshines the movie. And I would venture to say that's probably pretty true. But I mean, it does have its own fans. It has its fans like the Breakfast Club has its fans. It has its fans for the 16 Candle kids who have their love of that movie. In fact, many of us thought 16 Candles, Breakfast Club, Pretty in Pink, and then Some Kind of Wonderful was our youth into our adulthood. And I would argue that's true. That's definitely the way I felt. So we're, I think it's safe to say that the Pretty in Pink soundtrack trusted its audience. It didn't talk down to any of them. It didn't over explain emotions. It literally was the soundtrack to our life. And nearly 40 years later, it still feels that way. So if you don't own Pretty in Pink, do your best. Try to find it. The OGs are kind of hard to come by, especially not beat up, because they got played a lot. It has been reissued. You can get it on pink vinyl. That's pretty cool. And I think there's a pink cassette tape out there as well. So check eBay, check Discogs, check your used record stores. Thank you for visiting the AV room today. I really appreciate everybody watching. I'm almost at my 1,000 subscribers number, and that will inspire me to keep going. I hope you enjoy, like and subscribe, leave a comment. I love the comment section. I literally race to my phone every time it pings to try to respond. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed. I do appreciate you, and I hope I'm not boring you. I hope I'm entertaining you, and we're talking a little bit about the stuff we love, because I got a lot of records to show. So thank you for visiting the AV room, and we will see you next time.